the first 18, it was very remarkable to me how clear that was, not just to myself, but with several other people that were in the same place that I was, and the same data, and yet was completely not part of the conversation. Okay. And as I say in the second edition, I think I don't know that I got a lot right. I think it's a framework. So it's not like I got right or I got wrong. I said it helps explain and understand and interpret a lot of very disparate information, a lot of very disparate events that are going on right now. What I got wrong, really, remarkably wrong, was occurring. When I wrote the book in 2014, it looked like it was just beginning to build up. By 2016, it was blowing up all around us, and of course, today it's like a revolt every other day. If you look around the world, so yeah, I'm not interested in prophecy. I don't do that. If you want to be wrong in the world of events, predict something. You will be wrong sooner than you want to be. But I think all the dynamics that I described in the book were far more powerful and moving far faster than I realized.
Mark, can I just make a side comment on your non-use of an article before CIA, which actually is what flags you as a CIA insider? And I'll quote one of the best lines from, well, there's a number of good lines in a great movie called The Good Shepherd, which I'm sure you've seen, in which the question is, why is it that no CIA person ever uses the before CIA? Well, when you refer to God, you don't use the article either, do you? Right. So it's interesting that everyone at CIA, that's the case with the CIA.
Actually, I never watched that guy.
Really? Oh my God, you absolutely should. It's such a good movie.
It's a great film.
I mean, I think he's an interesting character, by the way, in many different ways. But James Cecil Angleton. But no, I don't. And in fact, if you want to know the truth, most people inside just call it the agency.
So I would love to kind of back up for, especially for those. I mean, I think most of the people in the room have read the book or know the thesis. But I mean, I would love to get into, how did being at the agency, if you allow me to say it, how did it prepare you to see this coming trend? What were the case studies? What were sort of the philosophies and discussions that were happening at the time where you were able to kind of put this together before I think a lot of others in technology or in media were able to see sort of this trend?
Case studies.
Sorry, maybe that's not the right term.
This is, well, I mean, like you give the CIA way too much credit. This is what happened. Okay. I was an analyst of global media, which is probably the least sexy job in CIA, but it happened to be a privileged perch. Most of my career, or let's put it this way, part of my career, it was fairly straightforward. The open information was a trickle. It was way greater than classified information, but it was still a trickle. And so I had this privilege. All the media of the world came in, and if I wanted to have it translated, I could have it translated. If I wanted a video, I could see the video. And it wasn't just me, obviously. There were many of us in that position. And I mean, remarkably, I won't say not true, but very, very quickly, that comfortable world just went haywire. Okay, just went completely haywire. What I say is a digital earthquake, epicenter, let's say, Palo Alto, maybe. Who lives there in this crowd? Created this tsunami of information that just was unprecedented in human experience, and the numbers are all in the book, so I won't repeat them here. But it was literally unprecedented, and it remains literally unprecedented. We have never lived in this kind of a battering of information that we are today. And so, I mean, as analysts, we were used to going to 2 newspapers for France. If the president wanted to know how my policy is playing in Paris, well, 2 newspapers. Suddenly, like this gigantic wealth of possibilities, some of which had very original information, but just, we were stupefied by the volume of what was happening. What mattered were the effects, and people don't pay attention to this very much for some reason, but information different rates, you could see just ever increasing levels of social and political turbulence. And we watched that and we said, what the hell's going on? I mean, it sounds so naive today, but it was like we were thinking, well, on the one hand, you have this new information system, the internet. On the other hand, you have all that political turbulence. How are the two connected, right? I mean, that seems, like I say, an innocent question today. So when I left CIA, I basically found out that within CIA, I will say this, there were many people that got it, but the institution did not. The CIA is in many ways a wonderful institution, has brilliant people, very courageous. I mean, many died while I was in service, but it didn't get it. It's an institution, it didn't get it. So I wanted to make sure that what I was looking at had some grounding to it. So I basically spent, after I left government, my time researching this question. And basically what I decided was that our institutions were formed, our 21st century institutions were totally shaped of the 20th. The 20th century was top down, I talk, you listen. And that model of organizing humanity can retain legitimacy only if it has a sort of a semi-monopoly in every domain. And when that tsunami of information hit, essentially institutions when it
Martin, your audio is dropping a lot. If you happen to be like in a dead spot in your Wi-Fi for your house, you might consider maybe moving somewhere else.
All right, let me do that then.
Can I just frame? So I guess you got introduced, but can I maybe frame your book in terms of the context of where it comes in and kind of the major themes? I think,
please.
I mean, you're like a superstar inside Silicon Valley, but I think this is a slightly broader group, and so it might be my PMing like reflexes are coming in and thinking we should frame the conversation a little bit before we really dive into it. Do you mind if I do that, Erik?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the book is The Revolt of the Public, which Martin self-published, and then I think got resurrected by Stripe Press and was one of their early books, and then became kind of this cult classic in Silicon Valley. And then Martin was like, has been way too modest. He did a whole like celebrity star tour inside Silicon Valley when he came here, although he doesn't talk about it as people at CIA don't. But the book is titled Revolt of the Public, and I would actually put it in sort of almost a triptych. The first revolt is actually the Revolt of the Masses by Ortega y Gasset in the 20s and 30s, which was sort of like the masses reacting to the sort of pre-modern elites. And then I would cite it, and I think you accepted this comparison, Martin, in our interview on my Substack of The Revolt of the Elites by Christopher Lasch in the 80s and 90s, about how the elites actually, rejected that mass society that Ortega y Gasset warned about. And then you, 30 years later, are sort of framing the Revolt of the Public against that Revolt of the Elites, thanks to technology. And just not to butter your muffin too much here, but this book came out before Trump, right? You were commenting on the rise of populism and the rise of popular revolts against elites before it actually sort of happened, right? Even though your book was, I believe, was republished after 2016 with Stripe Press. Is that right, Martin?
Yeah. I mean, one of the ironies of this entire journey has been that I get credit for predicting Trump, and Trump was ever mentioned in the book. And I say I can't do predictions. So
no. Well, okay, but again, this is your false modesty, Martin. Like you didn't predict him and saying I think Trump's gonna be the president, but you just described every other phenomenon around the world that was Trump-like in nature, and then we had the Trump manifestation of it. But I mean, anyhow, so, I think you highlighted, and Americans are typically blind to this because, of course, no one in the U.S. reads international news. But you cited other examples, right? Like not the plantados. I'm confusing the Cuban refuseniks for the Spanish ones, but what became Podemos in Spain,
right?
Plus the
Indignados.
Indignados. Sorry. Plantados are the political prisoners in Cuba. Sorry.
Right, right.
In case everyone doesn't realize, Martin and I are both, of Cuban exile stock. So this is a side thread going to this whole conversation. But in any case, you cited the Indignados, which became a political party and a major upset in Spanish politics. And then you cited, of course, the Israeli thing as well. So anyhow, but that was all before Trump. And anyhow, I'll stop there. But that's the framing of the book. And I think everyone should go out and buy it. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I mean, to accuse a Cuban of false modesty, I mean, come on, Antonio. Modesty is just not in the DNA, right? I have this this framework, and the framework, like I said, helps you interpret things. But you have to be very careful what you're given credit for. I mean, if you never mention a person and you're accused of having predicted them, I think it's incumbent on you to stand up and say, wait a minute, I didn't do that. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, you're much better now.
Yeah.
Go for it, Catherine.
Yeah, I'd love to hop in on something that Antonio brought up, which was this idea that that's sort of a triptych, and that you're picking up where Christopher Lasch left off with Revolt of the Elites, or responding to it. And I'd love to dive into that more. So, there's a kind of a thesis that this is just an acceleration of kind of what we were already seeing in terms of the managerial class and the bifurcation of American society into elite managers and people who work in finance, and then sort of the rest of the masses. How do you think that your recognition of what technology has done has changed that thesis, or has it just merely accelerated it to the point where now, kind of, as you say, the masses have all of this information? It sort of democratizes where you can kind of get your information from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Lasch thesis explains pretty convincingly to me the pathology at the top, which is, well, what has gone wrong with the elites. Okay, essentially it's this idea of meritocracy, which is that if I'm here, I must be brilliant because I'm here. And in fact, there are many different paths to getting to the top, but somehow the fact that you have a meritocracy means that you must have merit. So and so you build this very smug, very self-satisfied, very self-referential, very incurious and unimaginative class. And I think that's a perfect description of our elites today. I think what has changed, of course, is these people don't own the narrative anymore. They're demoralized to the extreme because every time they do something that is erroneous, that is bad judgment, that is the sexual escapade, that is they take money, they are going to be exposed and talked about endlessly at levels and decibels that were unheard of and basically nobody could even imagine, unimaginable 30, 40 years ago or 25 years ago when Lasch wrote the book even. So I think what's changed very much, and honestly what's changed is the fate of the institutions themselves. I think the institutions themselves are in serious crisis. I don't think they can endure the way they have been formed, the way they were formed. And that's probably the most important part. And that was the reason I wrote the book. Because when I say institutions, that sounds very vague and general. But we're talking about, for example, all the institutions of democracy. And despite what Antonio said, I am not from Cuban exile stock. I am a Cuban exile. I was born in Cuba. And I take a few very critical orientations from that. One of them is that the worst democracy is infinitely superior to the most efficient and effective dictatorship.
Martin, we were talking before this, and you were saying that you don't believe in polarization, or you don't think polarization is sort of the right frame of addressing what's going on. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even understand. I just finished working for this set of pieces that are all about polarization. And I'm kind of shrugging my shoulders saying, I don't get it. Okay, I think Gallup just came out with a poll that said that 50% of Americans identify as independents. Okay, that's an all-time high. Another poll, and now I can't remember who it was, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was also an all-time high, said that they wanted a third party to be formed. So that, when you look at it, it does not give you a sense that we are divided into these two very passionately believing groups that are colliding with one another. When you look, in fact, I mean, of course, our politics are Democrats or Republicans. By the time that voting comes, each side hates the other side very intensely and votes very solidly. But when they look at their own side, there's as many people there that dislike almost as much. So what you have, I think, is what the internet does, what the web has done, is a tremendous fragmentation of the public, tremendous fragmentation. I always say that the old mass audience was like this huge, enormous mirror where we could all see ourselves reflected. I mean, we all watched the same shows, bought the same cars, and so forth. And that was the 20th century. In the 21st century, that mirror has just kind of shattered, fallen and shattered. And the public basically inhabits the broken little pieces on the ground. That is the way that politics is conducted today, particularly at the presidential level, it seems to me. If you can gather enough war bands on your side, that you get a majority to get nominated, and then to get a majority of the electoral college, you win. It's not like you just snap your fingers and everybody says, well, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and immediately gather behind you. I don't see that. And the polls don't show it. The data doesn't show it.
But Martin, how do we reconcile this with your recent Cato piece in which you were sort of, so for some reason the Spanish word comes to mind more, añorando, sort of having nostalgia for Burkean little platoons and civic society as it existed when you were younger, and when the Americans didn't principally identify with their political party, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've become a lot more political. There's no question about that. I don't think we've become more polarized. Those are two things that are very distinct. I think in the old days, when I came from Cuba as a kid, I mean, the Cubans, well, you know Cubans, right? I mean, it was like endless political talk. I love politics, but it was endless political talk. And I came to the United States as a kid, and lo and behold, nobody talked about politics. They thought it was the most unutterably boring subject on earth, right? They were interested in family, they were interested in sports, they were interested in going to the Masonic lodges, going to the sports leagues, going to the chambers of commerce. I mean, there were all kinds of local things that were near and real. And so when the subject did come up, it was discussed by people whose sense of self-importance, of the sense of meaning and of human dignity, were gotten from elsewhere than politics. So you could engage in compromise because the stakes were fairly small. I think today we're very political, and yes, at the top of that scale of political activity, you get two parties, but we are not polarized. I don't think we're very politicized. Everything is politicized, but there's more than two poles to this. There's a lot of fractured pieces.
It's funny that your baseline is set from the Cuban example. The Cuban version of the Jewish joke is 2 Cubans, 3 political parties, which is which is of course ironic, because now in Cuba there's only one political party. But that's a different story.
Yeah.
Can I ask how this I mean, polarization might not be the word, but sort of siloing fits into the broader media culture? Because you recently wrote a piece for City Journal about how changes in advertising models, the decimation of print media advertising moving towards paywall actually leads to a broader siloing. I'd love to hear sort of how this thesis that you were talking about, far before there was sort of the polarization we're seeing, or maybe not polarization, but the sort of politicization that we're seeing at places like the New York Times and the Washington Post over the past few years. Would love to hear how you think that's playing into it.
Yeah, this is the thesis is called post-journalism, and I'm not the one who came up with it. It's a very brilliant media scholar called Andre Mir, and I recommend his book to everybody. Yeah, I mean, here's the strange reality of media. Nobody ever made money selling news. I mean, that was never the case. In the old business model, the news, but also the sports page and the comics and the crossword puzzle and advice to the lovelorn, all packed into one big bundle, bought you a lot of eyeballs, and you sold those eyeballs to advertisers. And that was a tremendously profitable business model because each newspaper had a kind of a monopoly over a region. Well, of course, that information tsunami blew away that model. Okay, that's another moment of legitimacy that's gone. All the advertisers have moved online. That is never going to change. And that's going to kill off most newspapers. I don't think there's any doubt of that. A few large, famous, prestigious brands like the Washington Post and particularly the New York Times have tried to somehow save themselves by bringing people inside of a paywall, make them pay as digital subscribers and live inside of this paywall. The problem is we're dealing in a world for practical purposes of infinite information, right? So you have the news chasing you. In the olden days, we were supposed to keep up with the news. These days, the news tries to keep up with you. I mean, you can't bat them away. Information comes at you whether you want to or not. So why would anybody want to go inside that magic paywalled garden of news? And I think very accidentally, the New York Times came up with this business strategy, which is during the 2016 presidential elections. They were pretty explicit about it, by the way, which is, no, we're not selling news. We're selling a creed. We're selling an agenda. You believe in certain things. In this case, Trump essentially was the end of the world as we knew it, and we must do everything we can to stop this man and stop the people who are siding with him. And so, if you want to hear your position articulated by people who are professional writers and can articulate it better than you can, and can dig up evidence and give it to you, and so you can use it with your friends and opponents, come inside this magic paywall to this magic garden of news, and you can you can all be like congregants at this creed, at this church, the Church of Anti-Trump. It was essentially an ideological posture with a hidden business model, and it was massively successful. I mean, digital subscriptions at the time when Trump was elected were hovering around 1 million and flat. Within a year, they had doubled. By 2016, they had 6 million, which is the most in the world. So, interestingly, though, the man is gone. I mean, the question is, it's a creed, but it was very much based on a personality, Trump's. And so my question is, what happens now, right? You have Joe Biden as president. Number one, he's not a Republican, so he belongs to more or less the side that the Times has been advocating for. But more importantly, Biden is probably the most boring politician who has made it that high in my entire long lifetime. So what are you going to do? I mean, how are you going to generate excitement? So Andre Mir says, look for the second quarter earnings of the New York Times. The first quarter will probably have some lingering Trump effect. Second quarter, and see whether that digital subscriptions go flat or start to decline.
Mark, you were speaking about sort of the fragmentation of the internet, and I don't doubt that on one side of the barbell there's quite a long tail, but the whole other side, it seems that there's more conformity than there was even a couple decades ago with sort of the internet mob enforcement dynamic. Like if the movement wants Parler banned, the companies banned in quick succession. If they want the Hunter Biden discourse shut down, both on traditional and social media, it's shut down on quick succession. Would you deny that the increasing conformity in conjunction with this small fragmented long tail?
Well, two different things that I guess you can talk about there. The conformity in trying to stop little trickles of content, even little platforms like Parler, to me, is using 20th century techniques to try and alter the 21st century information landscape. It can't work. This is really a Marshall McLuhan moment. It's the medium, not the message. It's the amount of information, not any particular trickle that's doing the damage. So there's that. The second part is the conformism is an amazing factor. I mean, there's no question about that. I don't see it necessarily in in the way you are describing, which is more these moral stampedes where we have to do something and we have to be seen to be in the right side. That's not really conformism. That's just moral panic. It's these websites. It's these websites that demand, basically, you have to mutilate your organic self to join hands with the digital them in these websites. And if it's so you look at a group like Wall Street Bets, which, I mean, what would the thing have been 30 years ago, 20 years ago? Well, it would have been an investment information site. Perfectly normal thing. You go in there, and it's a tribe. It's a war band. It has identity markers. It has ritual jargon. And if you stray from the accepted folkways, you get cast out. If you attract enough hostile attention, you get, reputationally, to be sure, you get burned at the stake. And this shows to me most clearly, and I'm kind of fascinated with the last generation to come on the scene, the Zoomers, and they represent this the most. It's a generation that basically is hard to get a read on because most of them have their noses to the grindstone and want to attract zero attention for fear of being cast out or burned at the stake.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Because I do believe clearly there's this anti-institutional sort of trend that's happening, but in some ways it seems to be strengthening the very institutions that maybe 5 years ago were struggling. So we already talked about the New York Times subscriptions are up. I was a reporter at the Washington Post in 2014. I mean, they were laying off people. It was something like 800 reporters. Now there's something like 1,600 reporters in the age of Trump. Harvard applications are up at I think at an all-time high. Even your former employer, the agency, to use your lingo, had the best year of recruiting in the last 10 years. What is it about these institutions that were failing in the early 2010s, or were kind of having this panic of are we losing our power, where in 2021 they all seem to be doing quite well?
I mean, are you kidding me? Look at the New York Times is a drama that never seems to end. I think, okay, you have to have a long view. And I think we tend as Americans to try and view things from one moment to the next and had very short memories. We have gone through an extraordinary period. Trump was an extraordinary politician. He was the gift that kept on giving. And I'm here to tell you, I was a Trump profiteer when he was elected. My book started to skyrocket in sales. I'll miss him dearly. But the fact is, it's hard to repeat something like that. And the long-term trends, these institutions are not healthy. They are still in crisis. They are still in collapse. Whether the New York Times 50 years from now will be here, probably, but it will be some sort of legacy brand. It will not be what it's not. It will not be the agenda setter. It no longer is the agenda setter. In the 20th century, the front page of the New York Times basically was copied by every newspaper in America and determined the evening news. That never happens anymore. Nobody cares. So the CIA, you can get, I mean, for example, journalism schools have been booming for years. Does that mean that journalism is booming? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of people, a lot of young people who have a lot of ideas about what they want to do with their lives, and they join these institutions thinking that that's what's going to happen. And but probably it's going to be a lot of disillusionment down the road.
There's this interesting tension where, similar to how, I don't know, a few years ago, everyone thought, Microsoft's best days were behind them, and now they're doing, better than ever. It seems that people keep saying this about the New York Times or Harvard in terms of their influence, and maybe among people in Arizona, or I don't know, sort of common folk happen to be in Arizona right now. But they're losing their influence. But in terms of setting education policy or just having influence where it really matters, it seems that they lose soft power as they gain hard power. Do you dispute this? Yeah,
I mean, these are all short-term trends. How
are you so confident that it's short-term?
Well, I mean, because they haven't been happening for that long. So, I mean, basically, these are institutions that depend on depend on the mantle of authority being wrapped around them, and they no longer have that. So Andre Meir, let's take the New York Times. Andre Meir tells a real funny story, okay? And I think it applies to the New York Times, and it applies to journalism, it applies to many other institutions that kind of branch out and seem to be successful. But when you look at what they're doing, it's not what they're supposed to be doing. And I suspect CIA falls into that category. He says, in the olden days, when you went to the beach, there was a photographer. And he took your picture at the beach, and you came away with a picture. I was at the beach. Today, everybody has a cell phone. Everybody can take their own picture. So the photographer has a little monkey. So you can take your picture with a monkey at the beach. You couldn't do that by yourself, so you take that picture. I think the CIA with the paywall is the monkey at the beach. I don't see that as a permanently successful trend in the sense of ever returning the New York Times to what it was 50 years ago. We'll always have a little bit of influence. We'll always attract good writers and people who come up with ideas that get discussed. Well, probably so. But as trendsetter, agenda setter, information setter, no.
Can I ask you one question, Martin? And we riffed a little bit on this on our interview in the pull request. I mean, one of the things that I can't get my head around that I find sort of dangerous about this new world of, as you've highlighted, the role to the public, is what you cited sort of with the Wall Street bets thing, right? That it becomes sort of a tribe, right? That our virtualized tribe that, we make common cause with, common values, et cetera, is completely decoupled from the sort of colored squares on the map that have typically defined our politics and culture, right? There's a decoupling of bits and atoms, which decouples our mental lives from our physical lives, which has been particularly highlighted under COVID, in which we can continue to participate, right, with at least the Zoom class can continue to participate in basically, pushing pixels around. We're basically pixel pushers, all of us, instead of paper pushers, right? And still make a living, but that leaves us completely decoupled from the physical world we still inhabit. And so, I mean, that seems at some level at a core of a lot of what you describe in your book, right? That friction, that in some sense we've decoupled those worlds. And I'm not sure how you fix that, because the mass market world that that sort of preceded all this, the Cronkite world that the New York Times used to live in, or that advertising used to drive eyeballs, right? That world is disappearing, right? So I'm wondering if you've thought about that, or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, there's tremendous pathologies involved in this. One Zoomer friend of mine says, the pandemic is fine. He said, for my generation, it's always been social distance. They've always basically met through devices. So I think the internet, the web, the digital realm, I mean, that tsunami of information has a lot of pathologies built into it. And one of them is a conformism that I was mentioning before. Another one is the fact that you have to basically surrender your real self and project a shadow, and that shadow has to be mutilated a little bit to fit the community you're going to. And in different communities, you do different mutilations. And in the end, things that can be said and claimed and done that nobody would do to your face. Because to your face, it's always the danger that, no matter how small and puny you are, you may get angry and punch somebody in the nose. That's called human dignity. Well, that's gone out the window with this. Everybody can say anything, death threats, rape threats, whatever. I'm not aware that anything has ever happened from any of those things. This is very cowardly people basically expressing their feelings. But there are pathologies involved that I think are I have no answer for that other than, and I was hoping actually that the world of COVID has helped with this, other than you have to try and be who you are as much as possible, no matter what the setting. And I think maybe because if you can't show up at work on Zoom looking like you've been partying all the time or whatever, and you basically have to be more of the person you have been when they knew you as an actual organic entity. That maybe we can start that process of trying to see how we can be who we are on the web versus let the web determine what we ought to be.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the glimmers of hope that I've had. I mean, I think this app is actually an example of it. And I mean, this is like a separate theme that we may choose to dive into or not, but like this whole return to oral culture, right? Like a lot of social media is a return to sort of a previous sort of pretextual order. And the weird thing is that, you know, experiences like Twitter and Facebook, I think, mimic that traditional personal experience very poorly. And I've cited this before, like I moved to this small island, like a small community, and I understood for once like what real community is. And then I saw the fake sort of Facebook version of it, and I saw it was kind of a pathological version. But if you consider this app, for example, like why are things, relatively speaking, so civil on Clubhouse versus say Twitter? Because you're not face to face exactly, but you can hear like the tremble in someone's voice. You can imagine their face. It's a real human, like, let's just be blunt. Like your average human who's not a sociopath just can't say fuck you to somebody's faith, right? Like it's not something that most people are willing to do, right? In the same way that like order is maintained in my little island community because you can't be that much of a dick because you have to see them in the grocery line the next day and kind of pay the piper for that. Well, on Twitter, you don't, right? You can sit there and be a complete sociopath and never have to like look into the face of the person who either is crying or is now going to beat the shit out of you, right? Like you don't actually have to sort of live in the world in a real way and pay the price for your social behavior. I feel that experiences like Clubhouse are closer to that, right? There's a reason why at least I have not had sort of negative experiences on Clubhouse because there's always a moderator who's basically going to shut you up and tell you to get out of the room, which is what would happen in any dinner party or bar. If you get completely out of control, the bouncer, the host shows up and you land on your ass and you're out of there, right? And the other thing is just, I think in general, that level of assholery just doesn't exist because you feel you're having a real human experience. And I guess most people are not sociopaths. So my hope here is that the virtualization of our social lives will become more true to what it was before out of our sort of inchoate sort of initial stages of social media.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, do we try and project ourselves into the digital realm? And that can be very rewarding and it can be very enriching. Or do we allow the digital realm to tell us who we are supposed to be? And that is the path that basically annihilates human dignity, civility, and makes real interaction impossible. I mean, all those pathologies you were talking about in Twitter not only are allowed, they're sort of incentivized, I think, on the web, because the louder and meaner you are, the more that you tend to get engaged with some other person just like that on the other side, and then people stand behind you who are on your side. So suddenly you're the leader of the pack. And I think to the degree that we can decide who we are on the internet, what we want the internet to know about us, which is as much as possible who we are outside the internet, would basically make the internet what I thought it was going to be to begin with, which is a tremendously enriching tool.
Martin, do you think networks can replace centralized institutions, or how do you think? I know you have a couple frameworks about this.
I've never seen that happen. Networks sort of complement hierarchies, but I've never seen it happen. I'm not a fan of hierarchy, and I feel like the ones that exist today, because they're legacy hierarchies from the 21st century, are way too steep and way too slow. But you need them. I don't know any other way of getting things done. Maybe I'm just not that imaginative. Networks are good for certain kinds of information spreading and certain kinds of mobilization. But you can see what happens for all the protest groups that basically have been formed online as networks on an extreme sectarian and egalitarian basis is, since they're not hierarchies, they have no leaders, they have no organizational structure, they have no programs, they have no plans. So even when they happen to be successful in their protests, in the sense that people support them and whatnot, they don't change much because they don't have the wherewithal to manage change.
Well, that's the other thing. So that's another interesting point, Martin. We got into this a little bit in our interview, right? That you've got these movements, and it's funny, Zainab mentioned a little bit in her interview as well, that you have these movements that actually do manage to create, you have 1 million people show up, right? You have the Gilets Jaunes, or you have the fucking crazy thing that happened at the Capitol or whatever, and they breach the Capitol, and the dude with the Viking helmet ends up at the speaker's podium, but then like nothing happens. There's no sort of coherent strategy or political movement that comes out of it. There's nothing, and of course that doesn't mean that there isn't change, right? I mean, there's other mass movements like attitudes around cannabis or gay marriage or whatever that certainly have changed over the course of the past 20 years. So there definitely is ideological movement, but nothing like what came before.
Yeah. I mean, the movements I look at, which are the street protests, almost. I mean, you can overthrow something. You can overthrow even a pharaonic dictator like Hosni Mubarak, who had been there for more than 30 years. But then what? Then the institutions take over, and after the public in the streets of in Tahrir Square in Cairo had done pretty much all the heavy lifting in overthrowing Hosni Mubarak, it became a struggle between two very 20th century institutions, the Egyptian military and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Martin, there's a school of thought that says that if you replaced every writer for the New York Times or every sort of professor at Harvard with new ones, they would still have the same thoughts. That it's sort of a force bigger than any individual. And also, I'm curious, when you talk about earlier that these institutions don't have that much longer before being replaced, what do you see replacing them? And is it just sort of a copy of it, and so they're all going to think the same?
Yeah. Okay. Now remember, I don't make predictions. I didn't say that they are going to be replaced. All I'm saying is that they're in deep crisis. It's hard to tell. That's a hard question. Okay. And I'll tell you why. At least for me, I'll tell you why. In part, it's hard to tell the structural question from the human question. The structural question is they are structured for a semi-monopoly of information that doesn't exist anymore. Their authority rested on the fact that information was scarce. They had it. It was valuable when they dispensed it. When the president spoke or when the government gave out a bulletin about something, it was something of great value, and therefore you had authority. That is gone. And I think that can probably be addressed with reconfiguring our institutions. The second part is the human problem, the human question. And it's the fact that just, I guess, the last thesis again, our elite class is pathetically inadequate. And what you said is 100% true. I have been in France in a very elite convention, nice town, X. But I mean, by the end of it, I was going crazy because number one, all the ideas were the same that you hear from American elites, identical. Forget about Harvard. This is France. Secondly, there were this narrow band of ideas, this narrow band, global warming and the public, and the idea that the public lives in an information bubble, which I thought was fascinating by these people who lived in this tiny little informational bubble themselves. So I don't see much happening until there's some sort of generational change in our elites. And hopefully, I mean, this is not a prediction, just a prayer and a hope. The next generation upward will be more imaginative, more flexible, more courageous, and have more integrity. This crowd is hopeless. I mean, it's just hopeless.
So Martin, one question. So you mentioned that the elites are hopeless. Like, to my mind, social media is like body cams for the elites, right? Like the whole thing with, what's his name? Ted Cruz going to Cancun.
Yeah.
Like, that whole thing was triggered by, there was that frumpy little Ted Cruz with his little bag, fleeing to Cancun instead of dealing with the whole Texas meltdown. And then he had, right. And so but the question to me is like, did everything just start sucking, or do we just see the suck now, like live stream? Like, if you actually read back and read some of the more honest histories and the sort of less Whiggish history of the past, people used to show up in congressional votes like dead drunk. I mean, there was like outright corruption. Like, do things actually suck that much, or are we just hypersensitive in the same way that we like bitch and moan that like, oh, this like $8 hoppy beer that I got doesn't quite have the right malt, sort of taste that I like. Like, are we really, do things really suck, or are we just really kind of whiners about it?
all of that is true, I think. I think, I mean, having lived inside CIA, I can tell you what happens inside of an institution is messy. It's ugly. The best institution, the CIA, when my early years during the Cold War, it was a very clear sense of mission. And it was a very dedicated body of very smart and courageous people. But it was messy. It was messy. No question is ever simple, and how you arrive at a decision, turf comes in or whatever. So when you're on the inside, you see that. And in the old days, that was it. They came out and then you put golden words around whatever you did. And that was it. Today, all the insides are outside. And the public is horrified. This is what happens inside these places. And yeah, I agree. I don't think it's probably in some sense not worse than before. But the problem is that doesn't matter. You now have to come up with an internal process that reflects, I mean, this is a democracy, right? That reflects the public's expectations. Now, also, and this then puts the finger back on you and me, we as the public have to temper our expectations about what is possible. And I think it's not just being whiners, which is sometimes true. I think it's having these utopian hopes about what politics can do for you or what government can do for you that, as I was talking about before, an earlier generation of Americans would have found preposterous, because all those things that you're hoping for, you'll find in your private sphere. That's where all the fulfillment of life happens. That's where your loves and your hates and your passions and your interests. That's where that's the theater where the drama will play out. We want some distant thing in Washington somehow to deliver those things for us, and it's very destructive of our belief in democracy, because it cannot possibly deliver that.
Martin, you said something really interesting there where you said our insides are on the outside and the public is horrified. And what's really interesting is I think there's, one thesis that transparency sort of crept into our institutions and everyone, was horrified at what they saw. But at the same time, I feel like our institutions modeled themselves after what some people refer to as like internet voice. And there's a clear example of this in my mind of when it happened to the CIA. It's like every politician started trying to like speak an internet voice to show how authentic and transparent they were. Every institution, wanted to really feel young and hip and kind of clear on the internet. And I remember when the CIA's Twitter handle started like tweeting out ridiculous memes. It was almost like they hired like a 19-year-old intern to be like cool and hip. And you're thinking, this is the most serious institution, or should be a serious institution, and they're acting like a Wendy's or an Arby's. And I'm wondering, like, is that part of the problem? Is that a lot of our institutions have just decided not to take themselves seriously, even when they should be very serious?
My take on that, honestly, is. I've been out of government for a while, so I'm speaking in part from the inside, but mostly from the outside. There is something about these 20th century hierarchies that simply doesn't get digital. And honestly, I'm not sure what it is. Simply doesn't get it. I mean, State Department had it was a very well thought out, very smart people, multi languages, Arabic. They were responding to ideas in the Arabic world that might be harmful or lead to terrorism or whatever. But you have to run those ideas up the flag of the organization. The internet is like now. Somebody post 10 seconds later saying, no, here's where you're wrong. 5 days later, after everybody had cleared the language and the words and whatnot, things got posted. And it was like, what was that about? What are they talking? I mean, it was completely bad. The health website, health insurance website. I mean, a disaster. I don't know what it is. I have no answer for this. But there's something in these institutions that just doesn't get digital. They stare at it and they go, oh. And then you're right. They kind of probably sound like, some stumbling kid trying to maneuver through a process that they have no clue about. But the reality is, what we need is people in these institutions who get it, who get digital. And when I think that happens, and it will certainly happen generationally, change may well happen organically. Structural change may happen organically, simply from people who are born to the web, shaping government to their own ends.
So Martin, I hate to suggest that you're being too optimistic, which I think you're rarely accused of. But is it possible you're too optimistic on the point that you just made, that these legacy institutions or these historical institutions will actually adapt, because now they have the challenge of adverse selection, right? Which is basically like, it's the basic question all these institutions have, which is, where do the really young, dynamic, effective people want to go? And to the extent that there are new institutions and new efforts and new projects in the world that can kind of draw, the kind of people who, 50 years ago or 100 years ago would have staffed, a giant organizational, matrix in a big institution, to the extent that they're just not willing to go there because they're kind of more productive and easier places to get things done. Is there a chance that basically means that what you just said, that basically these legacy institutions will simply never adapt?
Well, I mean, the answer, the short-term answer is for sure that's true. I'm not sure how long-term that can last. I'm not sure how you can have a set of basically essential institutions to the life and survival of a society totally out of sync with practically everything that's going on in that society, right? I mean, when you have that, something drastic is going to break, and my hope is that it doesn't. My Cuban background says that is never good when it does, and yeah, okay. I've always been short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. You could always kick the can down the road. In the end, it's kind of like an act of faith. But you know what? Again, and I would appeal to my Cubanity one last time here. I have a lot of faith in the American people, even in these wacky times, even in these distemper times. I'm very proud of being Cuban, but you see what's happened in that island, and you go, well, that's. There was something about that population and its interaction with politics that was just wrong, and when you look at the American public in the end, I think a lot of what we talk about here, for example, is what's in the news and what's uppermost in the information sphere. And I think when you look at, I would guess the majority of American lives, that has no impact on any of that. People are just trying to live. People are just trying to move on. And in the end, those institutions are going to be determined by what these people decide, what the public decides. So I'm going to say the American people are going to make sure that they get the institutions that they want.
So let me just ask one follow-up, going back to Katherine's question. So the other side of that, because I sounded like I was being very negative on the existing institutions. The other side of that, to Katherine's question, is a point that you made in the book that really struck me, which I thought was both very funny and also very kind of telling, and I've thought about ever since. Which is, you basically say in the book, like in the old days, 50 or 100 years ago, like if I was going to start a new institution, I was going to try to give it the most serious name I possibly could, right? And so the companies had names like General Motors, right, and International Telephone and Telegraph, right, and General Electric, and right? These, Bank of America, right, Federal Express. There's a classic story, actually. Fred Smith, the founder of Federal Express. I didn't realize Federal Express wasn't a government agency until I was like in my mid-20s. Right, because Fred Smith, in the 1970s, famously gave it the name Federal Express, quite literally, so that it would be imbued with basically this sort of institutional authority of effectively the government. And so sometime between then and the 90s and 2000s, to Katherine's question, all of a sudden all these companies have these Google, right, and Yahoo, right, and all of these TikTok, right, and all of these kind of very fanciful names, right. Here we are in Clubhouse, right. This app could be the institutional brotherhood of collaborating groups or something, right. Instead, it's Clubhouse, right. And so and then to Katherine's question, the way I interpret it is kind of is if the old institutions are hamstrung by adverse selection and sort of legacy structures that don't work well anymore, are the new institutions hamstrung by basically quite literally not taking themselves seriously enough?
Yeah, I mean, that depends. Okay. And let me give you kind of a maybe a little, I don't know how parallel this is as an example, but many years ago, say 40 years ago, when every government in the world met, what you saw were a bunch of suits. All right, a lot of people in suits. They stare at each other and they use this jargon, and they had this look to them. They were serious. They were important. Whatever. There was one government in the world at that particular moment who did not look anything like that. It was the Israelis. Okay, and you look at the Israeli government, and they just went there and they had this weird look to them, very informal. Okay. But they took themselves seriously. They were probably the smartest government on earth at the time, primarily because if they hadn't been, they wouldn't have survived. So I don't necessarily think that you have to be pretentious to be serious. And I don't even think you have to be serious to be successful. I think you have to basically take your mission seriously, but that can be done in many different spirits. And I think you can do it in a very informal and almost a fun spirit if you want to. And I think that's kind of like the spirit of the web, and still, achieve what you're after.
Martin, you're
can
revealing
I follow up on
Sorry.
on something Mark said there? Because I think, naming your company Google is one thing and being sort of whimsical. Like Elon Musk was on a Clubhouse show called Good Time Show like 2 weeks ago, and he basically said, I'm going to bet on whatever's funny, and that's going to win. And that's why I'm investing in Dogecoin. I mean, we have a society of people who cannot take anything seriously anymore. I mean, even GameStop, when you think, okay, I'm going against, some of my better interests by putting all my money into something, but I'm doing it as part of a joke, or I think some people see it as a revolt. Other people just saw it as a funny thing to be part of. And so I'm very curious if this sort of new whimsy has turned into America just kind of giving up on itself and taking everything as just this humorous joke. And there's other society. I'm very long on America as you are, but there are other societies that are far more serious about their missions than sort of American internet culture. And I worry that a lot of our institutions see American internet culture and kind of see the lack of seriousness and say, to compete for talent, to compete for the young kids that are really excited about Reddit, we have to mimic that voice. Whereas you don't see China doing that. You don't see ISIS doing that. You don't see people who are far more serious about their missions, kind of taking on that voice.
But I think we're conflating two things. I think we're conflating formality with seriousness, right? By the way, Martin, I love that you're revealing like the always latent Zionism of Cubans by elevating the Israeli government as sort of the model. But I see what you're saying. I think to me, the real villain here is irony. Like the real bugbear of like postmodernity is irony. Nobody can play it straight. There is no earnestness. Nobody. I mean, even the damn Capitol rioters, whatever the hell, were a joke in the end. With nobody plays anything straight anymore. It's just bizarre in a sense, right? Like earnestness is actually the thing at a premium that doesn't exist at any level of life. So, like to cite your example, the Israelis, it might have been informal, but they were deadly serious. Right?
Yes,
they're the most serious people in the world.
yes.
Right? There's formality and earnestness are very different things, right? And so, like, anyhow, I would just draw a line there between those two concepts, right? That I'm fine with formality going away, but actually, I think we have like this massive overdose of irony that we have to get rid of.
Yeah, and I honestly believe that happens in the course of life. You can be ironic about life if you're single or you are in a relationship and have no children. If you can be ironic about your children, I don't know what kind of a creature you are, right? So basically, life takes care of that. And if you're not ironic about your children, suddenly a whole lot of other things that you might have been ironic about, you are not going to be ironic about because those children are going to be living in that world. So I agree 100% with that. I love irony. The boomers invented irony, okay? And I'm a boomer, and irony is cool, but you can't live it. You can't live irony.
Martin, do you think the U.S. is showing signs of heading to a civil war? And if not, like, what would those signs look like theoretically? And do the Americans, do we have the energy, or to Antonio's point, the seriousness to actually commit physical violence? And if not, what form of Cold War could it be?
No, it's my answer. Not remotely.
You can't have a civil war when everyone's being ironic. There's no ironic Battle of Gettysburg. It just doesn't exist. It's impossible. It's a fucking Twitter spat that everyone just goes away and nothing happens.
What would it look like for you to say yes to that, Martin?
Well, okay. Antonio and I are being Cuban, by the way. It would take a couple of things. It would take a major idea that we are divided over. I mean, profoundly and irreconcilably divided over. That could be, in the United States, it was slavery. It could be, it was in Spain, Catholicism versus communism. Okay, these are irreconcilable. You either are one thing or the other, and in the end, all you can do is shoot one another to see who wins. All right, please, what's the idea we are divided over? I may be missing it, but I don't see it. Okay, we are. Is Trump an idea? I don't think so. Racism. Okay, everybody's against that. What is the idea? What is the idea? There is no idea. Second thing you need is, and this is actually a requirement without which you cannot have it, is a lot of testosterone, a lot of young men who are willing to go out there and not only kill, but be killed. And we have a short supply of that as well. So that's what it would take, and it's not happening, not remotely.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, we're all too like fat and lazy to actually run a mile and fire a rifle accurately. Like, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear your take on why that is. Why do we lack men and women who are willing to go in and fight, and kind of lack of testosterone? I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, in terms of what I was saying before, it's just simply numbers. We're just not breeding enough young men. And as a principle of life, it's good not to have enough people who are willing to kill or be killed. That was the problem with the Cubans. I mean, they believe. I mean, the Cuban history worked as follows. It was created as a democratic republic, and pretty much whenever it was not a dictatorship, which was one or two times before Castro, you would have an election, and the loser would take to the hills and rebel, right? Because I was robbed. So there was never a sense that you could accept the defeat of your side in a peaceful way. And there were always enough young men and violent thoughts that you could do that. That is just not the way America is put together, and I don't think it's going to happen.
But Martin, maybe that's a good thing. I mean, this is the genius of American capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, if Fidel Castro was born in the 80s in California, he wouldn't have gone to the mountains and started this whole thing. He would have applied to Y Combinator and been your standard issue startup sociopath, in which he would have been sublimating his will to power via the cap table instead of literally paredón, which is the firing squad. And that would have been that. He would have been completely neutered, and he would have been celebrated. He would have pushed a little button at NASDAQ and the whole thing, and that's it. The Cuban Revolution wouldn't have happened. It would have become, Dropbox or whatever. Like, that's it. That would be the end of the story.
That is such a great thought.
Oh, and it's also, to go back, Antonio said something before where he said, like we have these sort of faux revolts where people show up at the Capitol in, weird headgear,
Right.
and nothing actually happens. But where do things actually happen? It's like the true protests of the world are happening in startups. It's like if you actually want to overthrow the taxi industry, you start a taxi company to rival it. And so it begs another question of, in an era of just hyper financialization where capital is cheap, where it's easy to funnel people into these sort of protest companies, is that actually where the real protests are happening? And in that case, then your thesis on we're going to build institutions faster is actually going to be kind of a kind of bloodless coup in many ways of the institutions that exist.
Obviously, there are many institutions out east where I live that think that and have it in for Silicon Valley. I don't know. It's possible. It would be unlikely, I would think. This country has deep roots. Deep roots. That's another thing that makes me long-term optimistic, is that our institutions have deep roots, and you can kill a lot of the growth, and it's going to grow back. And so it's hard for it to be it would be a radical transition for somehow our constitutional institutions, for example, to be replaced by startups out of Silicon Valley. They may replace the New York Times. They may replace a lot of informational media institutions. They may replace a whole set of institutions outside of the democratic set. But I doubt that would be impinged upon by startups.
Martin, what's your next book about? If you don't have one in mind, let's say you have to write one. What would you write? What intellectual rabbit holes are you going down? What questions are you trying to find a semblance of an answer to?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about it already. The thing that's kind of eating my brain these days is, and it's hard to write about this because it's different, very difficult to be empirical about it. But it's the fact that we have hollowed out society of all the sources of meaning, like religion and community and so forth. And we, at the same time that this has happened, the web has come along and made this, basically tempted us with this vision of all the kingdoms of the world, where you can, have millions of followers, even if you're just a member of the public, or you can dispute with precedents and scholars. And I think, I think a lot of the anger, of what it appears to be anger, and I think a lot of the dysfunction of our moment comes from people, many people whose lives are hollow and lacking in meaning, and are, like all human beings, trying to find it, and they're trying to find it in politics. And politics, particularly liberal democratic politics, are not set up to do that. So that's I spent several months reading on this and thinking about it, and I have barely even begun to scratch the surface. I would never write another book unless I had another book inside my brain, and I don't have one now. But if you're talking about what subjects I think are interesting, that is one. And I think, the revolt of the public is out there now. Everybody understands it. I think the crisis of authority is still very poorly understood, and I wish I could make it clear to people. I think January 6th, in some ways, you can say it was a revolt of the public episode, because you look at this crazy QAnon people, bursting in with horns and painted blue and half naked and whatnot into the Capitol. That was a revolt of the public moment. But I think the true analytic frame to understand January 6th is the crisis of authority, because the Capitol Police had 2,500 people, DC Police had about 5,000, and there were like 800 protesters. So they could have been outnumbered 8-1 or 10-1. And yet they stood back. And you see this, this is not unique. You see this again and again. The authorities feel like their presence is threatening and will spark further trouble, so they withdraw. So I think that's the way to understand January 6th, as a moment of the crisis of authority. And I wish we could discuss it more and look at ways in which we can, even with the current institutional set, flawed as it is, it still represents the will of the American people. Get our elites to realize that there are times when you just need to be assertive about the fact that this is the law, and this, the Capitol building, far more than the White House, represents the will of the American people, and you need to protect it. A mob of 800 people can take it over. That's a sign of a crisis, and so those two things, the moral and meaning crisis and the crisis of authority, are sort of eating my brain right now.
Good to maybe that's a good place to wrap. I want to be sensitive of your time, Martin. This has been a really great big ideas conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and I want to say to Mark, I love the Lorenzo de Medici look.
Fantastic. As the kids say, goals AF.
Mark, it's amazing. It's like, like Medici was the Sistine Chapel. You are the memes. It's incredible. This is the new culture to which you are a patron.
Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Martin.
Thanks so much.
We'll be back here tomorrow night for Matt T, BC, everyone there, and we'll get Martin back for round 2 at some point. Thanks for joining, Martin.
Take care.
Okay.
Thanks, Martin.
Take care, everybody.